going to record this to the cloud just for reference. And for some of you, if you do need a good night's sleep later in the week, as well as this evening, you could always email me to see if I can send you a copy of the video. So just words of encouragement from that standpoint. Okay. All right. My usual, I think, Delmy, can you hear us?
I can, thank you. I'm waiting for you to let me in on the other computer. Good evening, everyone.
I thought I had already, so
Oh, sorry.
that's okay. Bear with me just a moment. Yeah, I'm not sure I can, because I had allowed that, so I don't know why it didn't come through. Hang on.
Okay, I'll log out again from my other computer and I'll circle back in.
Okay, just leave one open for right now.
Yep.
That'd be okay.
Beautiful.
All right. Well, we might check. So if everyone would be willing to unlimber your microphones. That's going to be a new call to worship for me at some point. I can tell already. So Chris, I see that this is one time you can run, but you can't hide. So Chris, your mic still is turned off.
Gotcha.
Can you imagine what this would do in worship if we could just, be able to see who is really singing and who isn't during congregational worship, and just have the ability then maybe even to mute as well as to, well, never mind, I'll quit. Well, so to begin, the Lord be with you.
And also
with you.
Lift up your hearts.
we lift up to
We lift up to the
Thank you,
Lord.
Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is
It
right
is right
right
to
to
give thanks and praise.
It is right and a joyous thing, even with my hunch is that's probably coming from you. Test one. Okay. All right, let's see. Okay, it's working okay now. We'll start. I am going to ask, would someone be willing to offer prayer for us this evening? Go ahead and get a volunteer now before we take prayer requests. One once, one twice. Thanks, Dawn. I appreciate that. And it. So. Okay. Well, we'll open first with just your reflections on discernment from this week. Read the way forward, which again actually is under part 2. Just a reminder. So these next few weeks we're going to be talking about discerning guidance in a number of things, from books to nature to people and events. But things that maybe you put in your journal, just a reflection on on this week's reading.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting when I was in college and interning with a youth group, one of the youth pastor, he always asked us, whether we are reading the Bible for information or for transformation. And so that was pressed on me and has stuck around, but I never really thought about applying the same thing to reading other spiritual books or religious books. So, whether that's things for class or just things that I'm reading in the summer, I feel like, especially with seminary, it's very easy to get into the information mode. And so this was a great reminder that yes, this information is good, but there can be more that we get from these texts.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I think, I'll just go ahead and name, as we often say, that scripture during academic studies becomes more of an object of investigation as opposed to a voice of transformation. That I make the same argument with a lot of textbooks that we read too, which is frankly one reason why I give you lots of permission to find different places in the reading. So that you can find those places that kind of speak instead of trying to master the author's outline, so to speak. Other thoughts?
Not so much a thought as a quote that I wrote down from page 46. I just really liked where he wrote, just as it's impossible to see your face in troubled water, so also the soul, unless it's clear of alien thoughts, is not able to pray to God in contemplation. I just thought that was a good thought.
Yeah. Thanks, Holly. Anything else?
I like his idea of you don't just read the text, but you are read by a text. And that in the reading, God reveals stuff about ourselves to us.
Mhm. Which again, I mean, and for him, that would include scripture, obviously, but then also even the lives of other people and their writings from that standpoint. Had any of you, and have any of you read any of Thomas Merton's work at all? Okay, Deanna, you have? Okay, Seven Story Mountain or just selected works?
I've read his Seeds of Contemplation, and then also his book on centering prayer. Was it Open Hearts, Open Eyes, or something like that?
Okay. Yeah, Merton is probably not as well known in our generation. Well, I guess your generation. He's pretty well known in my generation, but it just reminds me how old I'm starting to feel on occasion. But his book, Seven Story Mountain, not just within Catholic circles, though obviously there, really was a kind of spiritual autobiography on par with Augustine's Confessions, and in some ways, even though it wasn't an autobiography, writings like Pilgrim's Progress, just the kind of book where people began to find in Merton's journey an invitation to their own journey, their own spiritual journey as well. Yeah, Chris? Oh, by the way, you don't have to raise a hand sometimes, just pop open the mic, I'll see that.
Okay. One thing that stood out to me was actually at the beginning of the chapter. It's on page 42 for me. He says, it means not simply reading about spiritual things, but also reading about spiritual things in a spiritual way, which I know has kind of been talked about a little bit. Reminded me of my undergrad program when I was talking to a professor, just kind of about fundamentalism and kind of a way moving forward. And so I was asking him how he understood scripture. And he's like, well, it's a sacrament. And I know that's not like quote unquote a Nazarene thing, but it's also very, very Wesleyan in a lot of ways. And I think sacramentally what he meant by that was receiving the words that we're encountering in a way that provides grace for us. So that was just kind of what came to mind from me in reading this chapter this week.
Thank you. And that would coincide with Wesley's vision of scripture, both proclaimed and read, as a means of grace from that standpoint. And even I often remind people, those of you've heard my presentation before on Word and Table, that the first half is the sacrament of the Word. Now that's sacrament of the Word of Christ made expressed and through the written word, but it is a different way of understanding even what we're doing during worship when we hear a sermon, when we take that same kind of sort of spiritual posture in how we receive it, which I'll confess to you, for sometimes me as a professor, at times it takes work. I mean, it's a kind of foreground background shift. I imagine for some of you who preach regularly every week, when you go and visit another church, to kind of turn off that part of your brain and just sit there to receive sometimes is a little bit difficult, to say the least. So I hope you hear that's not always an easy thing to do from that standpoint. Paula?
Yeah, I have to say that I really appreciate the fact that when I pick a book, spiritual reading takes place without even realizing it. Not just to know, but it's deeper than that. And I want to point out on page 42 at the bottom, it kind of goes into what the sermon is similar to the class from this morning, I guess. that's the neat thing about taking this class. They kind of are together, they're combined. It says God is always speaking to us, but it requires spiritual discernment to hear God's voice. See what God sees and read the signs in daily life. That just kind of stood out to me because when we have all this knowledge of reading, not just from the Word of God, but from all this, the great minds of spiritual formation, and even the books that we're reading in this class and the previous class and the class in the morning, when you're willing to go even deeper than just learning, God definitely shows you, or at least shows me what I need to do and what I need to see in my own environment.
Thank you. That's good observations. Melanie?
A couple of thoughts, about reading for discernment. It seems to me like reading requires discernment because not all spiritual writers are necessarily created equal. There's always something for us to learn from people, but there's there's a lot of different kinds of views out there about scripture, which is one of the things that actually, one of the reasons that I was excited about coming to seminary is because I just wanted to study, God's word and what people wrote about God's word, not what people wrote about what people wrote about what people wrote about God's word. But actually seminary is not like that. You still do a lot of reading about what people wrote about scripture. But it is useful. So that's one thought, is that I do think that even though spiritual reading leads to discernment, it requires discernment too. And then the second thought is that it doesn't have to just be spiritual reading for God to speak to us. I mean, I think we talked about some of that already, but my one of my dearest friends is an English teacher, and she teaches high school, and she reads the high school novels. And every time she talks to me about the high school novels, she sees so much spiritual wisdom in all of them about human nature and how God is and how we should be. And she has a great gift for that, which she's able to share in her public classroom. So I appreciate that, in all readings and movies and lots of things, there's opportunities for God to speak to us and teach us discernment.
Yeah, and I was trying to think, you're absolutely right. I mean, he lists a ton of people that affected him on page 43, but I'm trying to think of, the writings by people like Etienne Gilson and Aldous Huxley are not exactly what you would call devotional reads, to say the least. And I do think there are times where God speaks through a host of different types of literature, definitely through novels as well. So you're dead on, Melody. And I just for sake of time, I will say that his the little exercise that Nowen didn't put in here, I'm pretty sure that I don't even think Michael Christensen did. This is what I think Rebecca Laird, part of what she contributed, are the reflections at the end of this, exercises for deeper discernment. In this first one, what books have shaped your life, your history with God. Write 3 paragraphs about books or ideas that have shaped your sacred history. Even if you have trouble connecting with Nowen's historical journey, that's an interesting little exercise. If this was and I'm just going to name it. Sometimes Nowen is very Catholic and very straightforward. He's not going to apologize for that. And if you're going, I can appreciate what Nowen's saying in general, but I don't get this 7-story mountain and everything else. There is opportunity just to kind of go, so who has been influential? Who are those authors that sort of engage you from that standpoint? And it's a good place for you to kind of begin to think, if I have a sort of a spiritual, not so much autobiography, but a spiritual biography, the people who are the voices in my life, who are they? Particularly those through writing. And it's an interesting one to keep as we go through the next 4 weeks of thinking about the same kind of contribution in your own journey, how God has been speaking. So it's a suggested exercise. It's not mandatory. There's no forum post. Okay. So just something for you to think about from that standpoint. Well, I keep saying this. I know this is taking us about 15 minutes, but this is a part of the class. I mean, for all of the fast track and designing your life and all the other things that we're going to do, taking time just to allow sort of now and to speak in the midst of those periods is part of what this course is really designed to do. So just to offer that. Prayer requests, updates, and Dawn, I know keep a pen. You can keep a pen handy or not from that standpoint. So, but any updates or Melody, your mom's do it back to your dad and mom's doing back to normal, I guess the best way to say it.
So I think, did I tell you that my mom had a heart attack last week? I can't remember if that happened before or
No,
after class.
It had
Yeah.
to be after class. I think I would, that one I might have remembered. There are times
Yeah.
when, so.
So my dad got over COVID. My mom had a heart attack last week and was transferred from our regional hospital up to Brigham and Women's, and they were able to do a cardiac catheterization and a really technical procedure that's not available most places, and did some good work for her. At the same time, she got her positive COVID test in the hospital. So she's actually doing remarkably well considering what she's been going through, but could really, I would appreciate your continued prayers and praise, you know, that God's continuing to sustain her, but it's been a rough road the last couple weeks.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Other requests, needs, concerns?
Yeah, just continued prayers for my cousin. This week's just been especially hard on him.
Okay. And Brandon, for Keith, this will probably be an extended journey. Just I think we all know that from that standpoint of being with other people who've gone through that. Any other prayer requests or concerns? Nope. Okay. Well, Dawn, would you pray for us? And turn on your mic.
Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight to be in your presence. If it is your will, Lord, we are seeking to hear your voice calling to us, not just through the readings that we've done before, but through this actual time together in class. The together and not together through electronics. You can still reach us. Lord, we are so grateful for the ability for you to all at once both sustain and be there for Melody's mother, to be in one medical center while she has a heart attack. Although it seems like a lot at one time, the ability for those physicians and nurses in the medical practice to be there at that time, to be able to transfer her to the place that she needs to be there when she discovers she has COVID. It's a lot, but at the same time, we see your hands on her. We see your hands on the situation, taking care of all that needs to be taken care of. And for that, we give you praise. We continue to praise. We continue to pray for the strength that Melody and her mother and father and all that are involved are going to need as they lean on you for both the physical and emotional and spiritual strength. Lord, we know that you know Keith's heart, whether he knows you or how well he knows you, we know that you know him and that he is loved by you, and that if he is able to seek you out, you will be there in a very real and physical way. It may not change the direct circumstances, but he doesn't need to go through this alone. And I pray for his cousin here, who want so much for him to know you and to feel your presence. May you reveal ways that he can be a part of this as well. Lord, these are sacred times, not just a class. May we remember that as we gather together to learn, we're not just learning with our heads and our brains for concepts, but our hearts as well. Open our hearts to that, Lord, and quiet all of the voices that we don't need to listen to, that we don't need to hear, the ones in our heads, the noise that makes the noise, so that we can listen to your small, quiet, still voice calling our names and calling us to you. I ask this and all of this in your son's precious name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks, Dawn, and appreciate it. Just so you know, others will be invited to this process as we go along. Just to keep that in mind. Well, we are going to probably go first thing into your small groups and begin talking about the market research that you did, hopefully this past week. I did want to point out a couple things just briefly before we get there. One, I sent you should have got it as an email, but it's in the announcements. So let me just pop up. Everybody can see my the Moodle site, right? Okay, so just a couple things so we know. One's just a reminder back from week 3, and I'll open that, is that toward the bottom, there is this kind of post a summary of your interaction of Ideate by the beginning of week 4. And I didn't stress that last week, so you don't need to stress out about by the beginning of week 4. But this week, maybe the next day, before we get too far down into position, just how you interacted with Ideate, what you thought were the strengths of it. It gives me a snapshot of how you're processing this material. And it kind of helps me to know that. So that's a reminder. The other thing to remind you, just in housekeeping, is this week's going to feel odd because week 4 and week 5 covers position 1. It says position 1 and then position business model. But if you're in Kaufman, you're going to note that there's a whole section down here on pricing strategy, legal strategy, and business exits. And I'll be upfront with you for next week. So let me just flip back to where I was before, if I can. I'm going to be asking you to work on the business model next week. But if you think you already have that, you can do option 2. You don't have to. You have a choice between those two. So if you're going, I really am struggling with what pricing would look like. I think I've got at least the beginnings of a business model, and I want to go deeper down. You can choose option 2 instead of the primary option. But for those of you, this is a fairly new engagement. Actually, the business model is enough for you to work on next week from that standpoint. Does that make sense to everybody? I know that's my pet phrase, but I just want to make sure we have clarity of meaning. So next week is kind of door A, door B, or option 1, option 2. You don't have to do both. But they're there. If you're starting to feel energy around your venture, that would be work you would definitely want to do and come back to if you're really thinking about putting together a business plan by the end of the semester. So this is just a trade-off in the fact that we're dropping that other rail starting design thinking this evening as well. Okay. I hope also, I'm going to send you to your groups, but I do think this week, I suspect this week was a little bit more busy, kind of more of a help me Jesus moment, right? I mean, if nothing else, if you look at the looking ahead component under this, when you got to reality checks, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 reality checks and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 activities for this week. And so let me just say, Fast Track is about to ramp up. And if you hadn't figured that out by now, and if you go, I didn't get to do that much, I think I'll get back to that later. Do you remember my whole conversation at the beginning of the semester about this is more like Greek and Hebrew than it is about some other classes. If you start falling behind some of these activities, it can get you in trouble because the expectation is you continue to build as you go forward. Any questions to that? All right, then let me put together, and I'm going to just put everybody into your groups. Let me get the breakout rooms going. And one thing you might, just to kind of get you thinking as you're talking to each other. So what was sort of the toughest question in the activities and the reality checks? What was really difficult for you to wrestle with? How coming out of this, how do you understand what you would have through your venture to offer? It's just a prompt question. Who do you want to reach? Is it you start to see yourself more as a direct service, so you're working directly from business to the customer, or is it more of an indirect service where you're working business to business? And so I'll give an analogy for this for those of you doing consulting, and I'm thinking about Deanna and others. If you're going to consult churches, are you going to be a primary consultant to the members in that congregation? Or are you actually going to build it in such a way that you're primarily resourcing pastors and congregational leadership to then pick it up and guide that congregation? And there might be a hybridity there, but it is kind of wrestling with where you're going to go. For those of you who are working in social ventures, this is always a struggle. This is my good friend Rob Gailey, who teaches at Point Loma, says that many times we start 501c3 compassionate ministries when actually sometimes we could do far better to start a 501c or an LLC that curates resources for existing compassionate ministries. And then we are truly social entrepreneurs, because what we're doing is we're not starting a new direct ministry to a specific group, but what we're doing is thinking about creative ways of harnessing the resources out there to support ongoing groups that are currently doing what's going on. And when sometimes in market research around social ministries, you discover there are several of them doing what you want to do, and can you actually provide a very unique resource in the midst of that? These are just examples. I'm not telling anybody what you should be doing this evening, but things to think about. And the underlying question I want you to be thinking about, particularly this week, is, how are you trying to maximize the value to the very people who will receive your ministry, your venture, as much as maximizing the value to the organization that you're trying to create? And this is what marketing research really helps you think about, is how do I know that I will actually provide something that will really be value added, if you will, and important in the lives of people? And yeah, you could spiritualize that. We all can. So I don't mean that disparagingly, but basically, if you're talking about people as you're first engaging them, how do you build that platform so that the very spiritual care you want to provide is built on top of a perceived value that keeps them coming? Becomes one of the questions that a lot of times we have to deal with in our approaches to entrepreneurship. Okay. All right, 6:33. I'm going to give you guys the 7:15. So I hope you're here. We'll do design thinking second half. And this is really for you to work together and try to help each other on your ventures. And at 7:15, take or 7:10, take a 10-minute break, but about 7:20, 7:25 at the latest, we'll be back together in the classroom again. Okay. All right. Now watch my lips move as I set up the breakout rooms. Yes, and sometimes I actually talk to myself out loud, which means I better turn on the mute right now, okay? Okay, so I'm sending you to your rooms, and a shout out to Morgan being back this week. And I'm assuming that means no more evening duty, right? No more night shift.
Yes, it's finished.
Okay, praise the Lord. Melody
Right, for real.
Melody, you may swap stories at some point down the road, okay? I'm gonna turn you loose. Question is pertinent to others.
Okay.
Okay.
You had talked about when we started the Kaufman program or curriculum, about how some people might make this into a business and some people would have an alternate option.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit more about that? Because I'm quite certain that I'm not planning to make this into a business. So,
Well, yeah, that we are about to start that alternate option tonight.
oh, perfect. Okay.
So the alternate option is called the Odyssey plan that comes out of the Designing Your Life. So,
Okay.
that's why I wanted to record this. It to some degree, kind of getting to this point in the Kaufman conversation. Remember last week, it's like, do you really think you can do this or not?
Yeah.
I think that this is when the option comes forward.
Okay.
Alternatively,
That's awesome.
okay.
I'm very excited to hear that because I put all this work into this and I'm like, I know I don't have the passion to carry this to completion. I'm not going to run this business. So I'm happy to hear that we're going to start on option 2.
Yeah, I want you to hear though, and this I should be saying, I should wait till everybody gets back. So I would probably repeat this. I'm still going to ask you to stay with the venture.
Well, yeah.
Through the business concept map. So that nothing else, you have learned those kinds of skill sets so that
right.
Want to start another venture, or more importantly, if you're working with a community that really wants to do something novel and initiative, you have these sort of skill sets of discernment. You've been this experientially, okay?
That makes sense, yeah.
But normally about tonight is when I get these kinds of, oh, help me, Jesus moments. I mean, and it gives me the opportunity to sort of really enjoy them from that standpoint.
Well, yeah, I have, I'm sorry.
But then say there's hope in the midst of those moments. Okay. Go ahead. Get the.
Wow, my birds are really loud again.
That's okay. During the break, my dog gave me Simba. Tuesdays are long days for Simba because Simba has a bed he really likes right beside my chair, but I'm in teaching in the morning, teaching in the evening. And a lot of times during the afternoon, I'm doing other work in here. So there's no couch, there's no can I sit on your lap moments. And when I called for the break, the look in his eyes, those kind of Chihuahua, big brown eyes, it's like, aren't you done yet? I mean, you can always kind of, I'm know I'm anthropomorphizing those emotions, and the dogs don't quite have it, but you can just say he was ready to move. Let's put it that way. So
Yeah, I love Chihuahuas. I had a Chihuahua named Bella once.
okay. I am just when my wife brought Simba home, which was right at the start of COVID. So remember the kind of timing of that. I'm like, a Chihuahua? Are you kidding me? And there was just enough terrier mix into it, so it's not a pure Chihuahua, which is probably a good thing from my standpoint. But we become, just because I've been home all this time, we've become really close friends, I guess the best way to say it. And my wife, that comes awkward moments at times with my wife, for instance. So he's finally, over 3 years, figured out my wife's lap, particularly when she has a fuzzy blanket over her legs. I don't know, something about women and blankets that I have never yet figured out. But anyway, Simba goes, oh, there's a soft spot, and we'll go over there. But if I get up, Simba jumps up, and it just drives her crazy from that standpoint. So
She knows that you're the favorite, and that bothers her, huh?
Well, she went to get the dog. I mean, I was kind of at that point. We had had my daughter's dog for off and on all through college, and finally, when Rachel got her first full assignment, had moved, and so I was kind of okay without a dog for a while, and it was a matter of 6 months, and I knew we were going to get a dog. I mean, it was just self-evident from that standpoint. Okay, let's see. Waiting on Melody and Rachel. I think Paula's there, but Paula let me note that she's having dinner. So give her just a second. There's Chris. And we'll go ahead and get started. Just general questions, process questions. Obviously, I'm not coaching you in your projects at this point, but in light of these kinds of questions that I proffered, any questions about the process inside Kaufman up till now? Other than I had to talk Morgan off the ledge at one point when I arrived in her. So no. Okay. Let me just continue. I'll do a little bit more lecture around some of the principles in Kaufman later. But these first 2 or 3 weeks, I'm just letting the curriculum drive that conversation more than anything else. I will remind you that I can keep track, and the way it happens is that again, on the back end, as you're typing in and completing exercises, as you're saving them, Kaufman just records an X. It doesn't record your content, not that I can see, partially because of intellectual property rights around this material. The last thing they wanted to do was start a program where the facilitator would have all the information of every one of the programs to utilize. But they did want to make sure that people could help, the facilitator could know that people are actually using the curriculum. So I'll kind of get this kind of a chart toward, and about mid-semester, I'll generate this, and it will kind of let me know where you've been engaged, where you haven't been engaged. Obviously, there are going to be some weeks where, and next week's a good example, where there may be a whole block of activities that there's no X in because you're only using half of the option for that week. So it's not like you got to complete every one of these things, but it just kind of lets me know that you're actually actively engaging the curriculum, thinking, processing, working with it over time. I hope that's just kind of a truth in advertising moment from that standpoint. All right.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Like the last section was my husband and I, because I mentioned in my post that because we're starting a business anyway, he was sitting with me and he's like, Rachel, there's not X's on these ones, even though you did them. Did you miss something? And so I'm not sure, do every single one of those things, are they supposed to get it when you can see them on the side? Is everyone supposed to have an X, or if they don't have fill-in parts, do they not have to have an X?
Probably the best way to say it is this is in the background. So I'm not sure when it comes to what you're seeing when you save something. Let me get into the material quickly. But
I've had that same exact problem as well.
so when you
Where-
hit save, so let me just type.
I noticed that when I click the "was this helpful" answer, that generally is what caused the check mark on the side.
All right, well, so this one here, yes, no? That kind of a thing. So be upfront with you, I'm less concerned what you see as much as I see them on the back end. So if you are typing and saving, if the material is there the next time you come back, so that you can identify it, and more importantly, that particularly on the major assignments, so that when you get to, and this may take too long to load tonight, it's been buggy this evening. But when you get to the workspace, yep, I figured it would get buggy this evening. Well, I'll just say it this way. When you get into the workspace, that the information you've been typing as you've gone along, sometimes it finally culminates in ways that's helping you generate the broader assignments for the class. Does that make sense? If you are concerned, Kaufman actually has its own help. I'm trying to find it. I can't remember now. Oh shoot, it's been a little while since I've had to use it on their website, but you can file a request yourself to have them actually check and see if things are working well. So this is one time we're using a second party resource. Could be that I can't answer it, nor can the IT at NTS, but Kaufman has their own resource people that do investigate those things. Okay. Anything else? All right. Again, not for the major project, you do not necessarily have to generate a business plan. It can be the project. But there is another option, and we're actually going to start working on that this evening as we go forward. So the rest of this evening really is more around designing your life and the reading there. To kind of start out just initial thoughts as you sort of engage this material, things that surprised you. I know many of you posted already on it, but just things that questions you might have or concerns from that standpoint.
I love the flexibility of being able to use this book and what they discuss in so many different areas, because it's not overtly religious. I mean, they say it, they're like, yes, we're going to talk about God here, but that's not who we are. That's not what this is about. It could be used in the areas where you might not be able to get the same traction. And it's lighthearted, but it's not taken lightly. They're very serious about what they're talking about. So I think it would, you could use it. And I'm not trying to be like I wish so-and-so was here to listen to that sermon. They really needed to hear that. But I do see how this could be used in my ministry context with my staff, small groups of moms, with my own family members. I mean, it's really something that everyone has a life. So everyone can use this in some way, shape, or form.
Okay. Thank you, Dawn. Other thoughts?
I appreciated that on page 9, like start where you are, because I have a lot of friends that are like paralyzed by making decisions, and I'm just not wired that way. I'm just like, just make a decision and figure it out, like it'll be fine. But given the vocabulary, like these are all gravity problems, meaning they're not real problems. If it's actionable it's not a problem, it's a situation, a circumstance, a fact of life. And I feel like a lot of things that my friends get like tied up on are like, you can't even really fix that. Like, it's all like your perspective in that. And like the analogy of like wanting to be a doctor, but not wanting to do med school for 10 years, but in year 2 of medical school, you're practicing medicine. I think it's just like a helpful perspective on not making big decisions seem paralyzing.
Okay. Thanks. Anybody else, just to kind of get us started?
I enjoyed that the book is written in such a way that you almost feel like you are having a conversation with them and you're sitting in their classroom. It's a lecture. And also I want to say that I'm very thankful for this half of the course. Praise Jesus for it, or Dr. Blevins, whichever. But
I think Holly's already done the yay and amen on that one.
yes. But I think for me, this is where I'm at, and I'm excited to explore this part of it in my life. So I'm excited.
So yes, and maybe one way to think about why I dropped this rail this week, particularly in the middle of all that marketing research, maybe it's just to protect my class evaluations at the end of the semester. So that'd be one way to think about it. So, maybe at least instead of everything being a 0, I might get a couple of 3s out of this before it's all said and done. Who knows? But I want to play a video clip. Plus, I like voice when you can get that, and you've got, and I'm going to continue to stress, you have multiple voices around entrepreneurship and ministry. And if you're not tapping into that component of the course, if your motivation level is low inside the entrepreneurship side, listening to people who are in that journey is the most important thing. It will seed a lot of seed, as in SEED. It will give you the kind of voices that I believe are crucial underneath the fast track entrepreneurship model. And I'm not taking time for that in class so that you can have small group, or I could just orchestrate the whole class. But I want you guys to be able to work together as a part of it. But I do want us to hear from both Evans and Burns tonight, and partially as a way of introduction. So I hope somebody yell at me if this does not come through well. So tell me that. But let me play a short video clip. It's about 10 minutes.
This is the first time, after having had a 54-year-old program in human-centered design at Stanford, that it occurred to us, maybe we should apply human-centered design to the human experience.
Everybody can hear
How
that?
do I design myself as a human being? So that's like a big deal. And so let's zero in on that. That's like one of the really big ideas today, as Chris said right at the top. So this design thinking is kind of like the secret sauce. Tell us about the secret sauce, Bill.
Well, it's become a fairly popular phrase, this idea of design thinking. It's a methodology we teach people to do innovation.
Design thinking. Okay, everybody.
So,
yeah.
so normally it's applied to products and services. We work with banks, we work with big organizations, and we teach them how to do this. We teach our students this as well. It's a methodology that's fundamentally human-centered. But to frame it, let me just explain, this design, what's design thinking? Well, there's lots of kinds of thinking. We are in the engineering school. The design program is in the engineering school at Stanford. So engineering thinking, very powerful tool in your tool belt. Think of these as not one replaces the other. It's just a good tool. If you have an engineering problem, you want to use this kind of thinking. So if you want to build this bridge, right, you need to know the length of the bridge, the strength of the steel, and how many cars are going to be on the bridge. But if you know all of those things, we have the equation that solves that problem. The bridge will work. It'll work for as long as the bridge stands. And if you take that exact same set of parameters and put it someplace else, this is a bridge in Oakland, but you move the bridge to Boston, it'll work there too, because it's a very bounded problem and all the data is reliable. Now, if you went to business school, you were probably taught what we'll call business thinking. A little bit different in that the data is not so precise, but you can get information and some data about business decisions. Do I want to buy this company? You're now a company, or do I want to buy this company? Well, I can look at the rate of return on their assets. I can look at their profitability. I can project forward what you think the value of their future earnings will be. So we have all these little figures of merit, and we can optimize a decision. But again, lots and lots of data in that problem. Stanford, we do research. Research uses the scientific method. It's really what's sort of powered, the humans since the Dark Ages and the Enlightenment. You have a hypothesis. You form a very careful experiment to isolate a variable that you want to test for. You perform the experiment, get a data set, and then analyze your way into the solution. In that case, you can't change the hypothesis. That'd be cheating. Because if you change the hypothesis to match the data, you're not a scientist. You're, I don't know, cheating. You're cheating. You're cheating. I'm going to try to not make any jokes about the current administration and their lack of scientific thinking. But again, you have to be able to analyze the data set for this to work. Now you got people. Now we've got people in the equation. When we first started using design methodologies, trying to understand human-centered design, we went to the anthropologists. How do you study people? How do you study people in a non-biased way? And we went to the psychologists. We said, what are the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy? And we started looking at that and we said, okay, well, this is very interesting because people are a different situation. Let's say I had studied this group of people here, this table over here. I'd studied the strange tribe of cell phone users, and you all had different cell phones. And then I came up with all of the needs, and I asked everybody what they wanted, and then I produced the perfect cell phone for you. This is what would happen. I would show you my prototype, and you would say, yeah, I know I said I wanted that, but now that I see it, you know what, I changed my mind. It's maddening. This happens to designers all the time. It's terrible. People change their mind. What happened is, I know, but what happened is you didn't know exactly what you wanted. You knew what you had and what was wrong with it. When I showed you the possible future that you could have, you said, oh, if that's possible, you know what I really want. And that just keeps happening. It's what psychologists call a wicked problem. But we've developed a way of solving those problems. We've developed a way of inventing futures, right? That's what we do as designers. We invent something that's never happened before. And then if it's successful, if it really hits a need and it resonates with our users, we have a product that's successful, or a service, or anything. We're just redesigning financial services now, all sorts of things this way. So in design thinking, we say, because you don't have data that you can rely on and you can't predict the future, the only methodology for moving forward is to build. We build and we discover together with users. And that's really a fantastic methodology to use when you're designing your life, because you don't know what the future holds. And stuff can change rapidly. Your job could go away, or a new promotion could happen suddenly and you want to decide whether you want to take it or not. So in these uncertain environments, you want to use this methodology. We have a little diagram. We say we start with empathy. We start with understanding people and the problem, in this case, understanding ourselves and how the world views us and how we view the world. We redefine the problem. We come up with lots and lots of ideas. And then we do this prototype test cycle. We build our way into the future. So that's the method. That's the way we teach it. When we teach it in designing your life methodology, we had one step, and that's accept. That's something that everybody has sort of partially bought into today. You accepted to come here and take this class. That means you're interested. You may not be completely bought in on doing all the exercises yet, but at least you got here and you started. Accept is important. Dave always says you can't solve a problem you're not willing to have. I bet you have a friend, not you, but a friend who's been bugging. Every time you go out for a drink, they hate their job, they hate their relationship, they hate their boss, and they just keep talking about it, but they don't take any action, right? So they haven't accepted, wow, this is a problem I need to work on, and I need to move forward into some solutions. So accept is the first step in the designing your life process. Then we have this, we call it, think like a designer. If you have the culture, the mindsets of a designer, you will act like a designer. It's just behavior. If you act like one, I can't tell the difference between you and a real one. So if you start with curiosity instead of skepticism, because when you want to invent the future, there's no reason to be skeptical. You don't even know what it looks like yet. And it's much more generative to start with curiosity. Then reframe the problem. Most of the time, people are working on the wrong problem. And if we can get you to think about the problem correctly, like get rid of this passion thing, get rid of this I'm late thing, then you're opening the solution space, and now there's more places for you to have good ideas. Radical collaboration, that's why you're in a team we just mix complete strangers in most cases together, because your experiences are so different that when you collaborate together, something exciting will happen in the middle. And then design's complicated, and sometimes you're diverging and looking for lots of answers, and sometimes you're converging and trying to test certain ideas. You want to be mindful of the process so you don't get confused. And then the biggest thing is, We have a bias to action. Since the future's uncertain, you can't get any data about it anyway. Why are you planning? What are you planning with? You don't have any data. You're making stuff up. I like to say, no life plan survives first contact with reality. No matter what you plan, the world is out there changing things all the time. So it's easier to just start and do something that's active. And we take that design thinking thing, which is the way we teach design and design innovation, and we put it in a little bit of a framework to make sure, once again, that you know where you are. And we'll keep referring to this framework throughout the day.
It's going to be sort of our visual syllabus to help us find our way around. Now, when we thought up design thinking 55 years ago, it was really thinking about products. The program was originally called the Product Design Program, but it turns out this innovation methodology works more broadly. Now, when you're designing a life, that's really a much wider thing. So a couple more tools are needed, a couple more slots in that silverware drawer. And the top one is the meaning making layer. On the top, what's your point of view, what's your work view, what's your world view? We'll describe these things in just a minute. You did some homework on that, hopefully. There's the organizing ideas that help answer the question, is this really working for me? Is this the real me? How do you answer those questions? And then how do you want to even get to the information that you can answer those questions with? That's what the support layer is about. How do I discover and support what is in fact true for me? Of all those voices running around inside my head, which one's the real me and which one's still mom? How do I figure that stuff out? How do you know when you know, So there's steps that we can take that help support discovering the information, making good decisions, and sustaining this process. Because frankly, the only job we all know we're going to have to get someday is the job of getting good at getting the next job. We're just going to keep doing this life design stuff over and over again. You could actually make the argument that life design is what life is. We're all designing our life all the time. You make some big decisions, you live for a while in a chunk, okay, I think I'll raise these children. I brought them back from the hospital. I think I'll keep them for the next 20 years or so. You stick with that, but it does change every single day. And so we're always doing these things. Now we need lots of ideas and tools to fill this out. So that's what you're gonna get. So you're gonna get all these things today. By the time you go home, you get that whole set. That's what so we have a lot of work to do. Norm.
Okay.
This is the first time.
So let me stop right there. So I really wanted you to hear the author's voices, partially because I think it helps. If you sense humor in their book on occasion, yeah, they have a healthy sense of their own limitations at times in this work. By the way, and I'll go ahead and mention this, the video I just showed is part of a series that was done under an organization called Creative, where they took their entire program and did a video version of it. So for those of you that are really intrigued with this, that might be an option you want to consider down the road. When Creative sells it, I want you to hear this language. When Creative sells it and you just go on their site, it'll say $250 for this video series, right? And then you sign up for Creative and then you wait. You guys have done this, haven't you, with other services like this? And all of a sudden there is a sale and it's like 80% off our video services, right? Matter of fact, I've seen this version, which I do think they list somewhere around $200, offered for $19.99. It may not happen during this semester. That's the bad news. But it's one of those kinds of things. You go on, you buy a product, and then you have to figure out where you want to put their emails in a junk Gmail list, but you keep the eye out for the special around this kind of option. Does that make sense? If this really intrigued you, I will go ahead. This is my last plug for this evening, back to the Moodle site. So this is why I want to do this. So let me throw this up. If you go under our Moodle site, and you've got all these wonderful, many different sections, but you go all the way down to Designing Your Life Resources, and you open that up, you will have other resources. You get Burnett and Evans actually in a TED Talk. You get a couple of this is actually a 1-hour conversation with Burnett and Dave Evans. But if you notice, you'll also see things like Designing Your Life Resources. And if you open up that link, these are all the kinds of PDFs and worksheets that provide you materials. And for those of you who are thinking about doing this for an Odyssey plan, this will be a very important link So yeah, I expect you to sort of mark up your book, but if you're going, wait, I got a Kindle, what am I going to do? All of these resources are there, sometimes in slightly different forms, so that you can actually build these different kinds of Odyssey plans and that kind of material over time. So it's available to you on the Moodle site. And I did, just kind of fair use, provide these for the sake of the class. And you will find that they have a ton of materials. One, I just want to point out one. They have a kind of worksheet on how to do a life view reflection and a worldview reflection, and then tidbits of readings. And I always found this one, and then kind of quotes that they enjoyed that they pass around. So you get leaders like Peter Senge and Mark Twain, Betty Davis. Why Betty Davis? Who knows? But right in the middle of it, you get John Wesley. That gets dropped into the middle of this set of tidbits that they use as a resource. So you have, if this intrigues you and you're thinking about how it works, there are materials on the Moodle site that you can explore to figure out how you might utilize them. Does that make sense? Any questions to that? No? Okay. Well, back to the presentation. This started with one book, just honestly, and I think you're already hearing, it was actually a class at Stanford University. It was an elective course that sort of blew up, and it was mainly for undergraduates who were not part of the design school. And they decided, what if we take these principles and start helping young adults think about what their future might look like? Since then, they've followed with two other books. One is Designing Your Work Life, and this is actually for adults who are already in a position. They're not necessarily thinking about leaving it, but then how might they rethink themselves from within that position? And they've written, the most recent one is called Designing Your New Work Life, which is for adults who are transitioning from one position maybe and looking for an option of moving into a new field. That one, more interestingly enough, was written right before COVID hit. And they had no idea of what was going to happen, the quote, great resignation that we're talking about in the United States, people deciding not to return to their jobs and looking for alternative venues of vocation. I suspect that book may blow up fat more than the original. I just keep us within the original because of the set of premises there from that standpoint. This book is actually works on 3 levels, so I'll just name it. One level, and kind of more than what you said, it's a great resource for friends, particularly younger people who are kind of stuck. And it was really written more than anything else, I think, with young adults in mind, emerging adults in mind, from that standpoint. It is also a resource, and I'll just name it, inside the MATL, because one of the reasons we designed the Master of Arts in Transformational Leadership was to help people think about the engagement between faith and leadership, but not necessarily always within an ecclesial setting. So yes, in social justice roles or even other types of settings, and this book gives an opportunity to kind of think, okay, how would I use my MATL in an innovative way moving forward? And so it can be for some students, and we've had them in this program, that this actually becomes a way in which they begin to envision how they're actually going to utilize the Master of Arts in Transformational Leadership as a pathway into the future. Does that make sense? So one level, it's to help others, and you could think of it externally, how this book could be a resource, but the other side of it is how it might help you, even in thinking how you'd use this degree. But both of those are not the primary reason. The main reason we use this book is to teach design thinking and not force you to try to build a second venture or prototype a product or do anything like that. Merely just use the resources out of your life and use design thinking, learn design thinking by using the very stuff of who you are as a human being as a beginning point to learn these principles as we go along. My famous phrase, everybody with me? Does that make sense? Okay. A couple of just general thoughts, and you'll get this. Design thinking sort of lives in between 3 sort of big pieces. User needs, this is why it's human-centered. I constantly remind people, this is really about people. Yeah, it is about people's desires at times, but they don't have to be misplaced or malformed desires. Sometimes it's their aspirations, their dreams, their goals. It's really tapping into where people are. This is one of the things I've always been fascinated about design thinking. You can't do it abstracted from human people. It doesn't work well that way. It does take specific goals, but it takes very seriously also constraints. And we'll talk more about that before it's over. And design thinking sort of lives in the navigation and negotiation of sort of needs and goals and constraints, and beginning to envision how one might go forward. As a model of thinking, it has infiltrated a number of different fields. And I meant to double check tonight. If not, I'll bring it next week. There's a missions agency in Florida, I think called SEEDS. I think that actually is their language. That was a mission resource organization that got involved with a local hospital that was utilizing design thinking as a new way going forward to reinvent how that hospital would provide services into the future. And this missions agency was invited into the design thinking process, and they realized the implications of this. And they began to reconfigure these principles in light of missional engagement, particularly around the globe. And that was how, and since then they've become one of the major resource agencies of design thinking meets missional engagement. And if you're curious about that, I'll make sure the link becomes available. And it really has become a very specific skill set that's being encouraged in a number of different fields. Tim Brown's book is probably, he's one of the major founders in the IDEO movement, and probably as a result of that, seen as one of the primary gurus. But there are a number of others, and now there are PhD programs in design thinking. It's most of the major schools. I think MIT has that, and you'll find this around the country, though Stanford's probably still the champion scene behind it. It does draw, you already heard this, so I'm just reminding us, it does draw on team-based innovation. It does focus on disruptive change. You've heard my definition of transformational leadership. How do we proceed when we do not know where we're going? You know, God, yes, we know God's in the midst of that journey, but how is it that we lead in the midst of disruptive change where we don't know exactly where we need to go? Design thinking lives within that, and these postures of bias toward action, collaboration, focus on human values, mindful of the process, prototype toward a solution, and this famous maxim, show, don't just tell, are things that really govern design thinking. Parenthetically, I'll say the first one, bias toward action, and I'll just make this is one reason why I got involved in it with clergy education in mind, is that I do think there are a number of pastors, not all, but that are really just not oriented towards strategic planning. And you may know pastors like that. I've had a couple that I've worked with over the years where they may get excited about strategic planning, but they just kind of want to do it like every year. And you keep going, wait, let's work this plan. And they're like, and I never will forget, I had a pastor, we spent a whole year designing a very complex strategic plan. And the pastor went away to a workshop, came back the next year, and suddenly we had a whole new emphasis and theme. And it finally dawned on me that for some ministers, partially because of the fluidity of ministry, they have a bias toward action. And they have been wrestling under a particular vision of leadership that says you must sit down and develop a strategic plan and work the plan to know where you're going, where I think design thinking would have freed them to actually be more effective by adopting this leadership posture than constantly wrestling under, somebody on the board saying, well, don't we need a 5-year strategic plan to, and let's sit down and have 15 meetings. As a matter of fact, let's get a committee to determine who is going to be on the strategic planning committee, and they'll come back in 2 months and they will design then the 4 stages of the strategic planning, and then we'll bring someone in who will actually show us then how we'll get a consultant to show us how to implement each one of those stages of the strategic planning process. And 6 months from now, we will begin working on the strategic plan. To which the pastor goes, I'm going insane. You can almost, I've been there in those moments. You can almost see the whole table vibrate. You know, their feet are kind of going like this underneath because they want to get on with it. And design thinking is a release to say, yes, you can get on with it, but it's not still willy-nilly. You're going to do a process. You're just going to trust the process in the midst of the action. Does that make sense? And as someone who's actually been at 2 educational institutions that sometimes gets lost in highly elaborate strategic plans, maybe this was my own self-defense to get involved in this kind of thinking as well, where I never will forget, there was a decision on what we're going to do about social media. And there was going to be a 4-month study to determine how a church was going to start doing social media. So the next week in church, I took pictures on my little cell phone, put them up on Facebook, and that's all that. And I was kind of like, now what are we going to do with this? And how do we design our way forward once we did that? You know, it's just moments like that I hope you hear. If you have a friend who has a high bias to our action and you want to provide something other than therapy for them, design thinking might be the most important way to go forward. Okay. Any questions or comments to that?
I think that there's a comfort with not necessarily having the first right best answer that plays into how people are oriented, because if you feel the pressure to get the right answer the first time, you're going to study it and study it and study it and study it. You still may not be right, but at least you can justify that you did all the work you needed to do to study it. And I see a lot of people in organizations doing that. But the bias to action, you have to be comfortable with a great option. That may not be the perfect best option that is possibly out there, but it works. So you need to be comfortable with that. And you also need to be comfortable with sometimes not getting the right choice the first time and having to try again.
Yeah. And truthfully, and what I'm about to say, I want to be very cautious. And I really do trust the Spirit is at work in this process. But I think going back to your having the right answer the first time, when you laden that with the quote guidance of the Spirit. So God told me, and there are lots of ways to think about that language. So I hope you hear, but this is our vision for the future. And then sort of as Dave Evers says, 2 steps out, reality steps in. Then I've seen a number of pastors, and I'll speak in an ecclesial setting for this, who just all of a sudden feel like they've been betrayed by God. So why is this not working? And you want to hear design thinkers would say, well, it's just because you hadn't tried it yet. Nothing wrong. Wasn't anything wrong in your prayer life. Wasn't anything else wrong. God is in the journey is one way to kind of think about this. So go all the way back. Instead of, if there's a danger that L. Gregory Jones would say is a back to Egypt committee, the other danger is the Moses saying, I already know exactly how we're going to cross the Jordan and get into the promised land. And I already got these 18 steps of foolproof methodology to get us across the desert. And then somebody decides to erect a bull and it all goes crazy, right? And this is the other side of that kind of what transformational leadership is about, is saying, how do we begin and then be adaptive in the midst of that from that standpoint. And I hope you hear this would help a lot of churches recognize that they try things and they can let with loose hands, or other organizations. I mean, a lot of times, again, entrepreneurship thinking is about minimizing the risk, not mitigating it completely, but at least making sure we don't spend $1,000 on something before we even know whether it's going to work. But design thinking is saying, there's sometimes you can work hard, offer an idea, and actually learn something so that the second time around, you actually are in a better place to make things happen. And that's just a posture that comes out of design thinking that I hope you'll hear early as we're reading this book. And the book is actually just giving you permission to use your own life and thinking about how this works. Okay. All right. A couple more pieces. One thing I do think is really important, and this is kind of how comes out of their language, is that problem solving is an aesthetic task. And then through the book, they are going to cultivate these sort of 5 basic processes and principles that underlie how design thinking works. They're going to encourage you to be curious. They're going to invite you toward action. They are going to, and one of the most important things I'm learning in design thinking is the reframing process. We'll talk more about that as it goes forward. Building this kind of deep sense of awareness and this real need for collaboration. So yeah, the same time I'm going to be asking you as groups to meet, not just to talk about your venture, but to kind of talk about your life as we go forward. And to them, these are tools that helps you, and they believe, build anything, including a life you love, as a prototype. So I hope you hear, they're not promising if you do this book, you will automatically have the life that you love, but at least you can develop a prototype of what that life might look like. That, yeah, they know you're still going to have to test out as you go forward. Questions? No? Okay. This is an easy read. So I'm not thinking, I mean, it's not like trying to explain BART, which at 8 o'clock on any evening, nobody would want me to try to do anyway. Some of you have been in missional theology is like, why didn't you talk about this instead of BART in that class? I mean, I know that. Step 1 really is empathy. It's really paying attention to where people are and what they want. The hardest thing in the world in design thinking is to really suspend institutional goals and to start where our constituents are in the journey. And that design thinking, that this is that human-centered part. And I'll be the first one to say, as leaders, sometimes we have a difficult time sort of disembedding ourselves from what we want, and I'll just want our venture quote to accomplish. That's an institutional goal. Instead of just asking, where are people and what do they want and what do they need? And I've been involved in congregate churches where church leadership gets locked into worrying about maintaining certain institutional goals and sometimes forgets where the people are in the midst of that. So design thinking just won't let you get away from, so where are our people? How are our people doing? Where are our people in the midst of this? And how do we learn to listen to them carefully? So in a kind of big nutshell, there are questions that you always are asking of constituents. And I use that word, I could just use the word people, but these are people that are connected to what you're trying to do. These are the very people that you're trying to relate to. And so let's go back to all that marketing questions that were coming up in Kaufman. If you think about those as just, well, how do I sell a product? That's one thing. But if you're thinking about those questions as, where are the very people who need the very service I want to offer, and how do I understand where they are and how they live? This is one of those crossover moments. And so we pay attention to what people say and what they think and what they do and what they feel. But underneath that, what we're really trying to do is get people to talk about this, the experiences that they've had, the hopes and expectations they might hold, is a result of our leading, and the current concerns or questions about the journey that they carry with them, and frankly, the challenges they might face going forward. And so design thinking, what kind of foreground background shift? I've had many times where I've been in leadership meetings where we talk about the challenge the institution faces, financial or social capital or lots of things. But the simplest one, and since I'm in the field of education, is just ask the question, so what's the implications for our students in the decisions we make? And what happens when that becomes the first question, other than how will the institution survive? Same thing in churches. There are a lot of times churches are wrestling over ministry programs and everything else. But the simple question is, so what is the result of this for the sake of our congregants, our constituents? What difference does this make for them of saying, well, what happens if we lose this position or we lose this program for the sake of the institution? Does that make sense? And there are times where institutional questions are important. Don't get me wrong, but in design thinking, at least, they're deferred. Why? Because the institution's got to be nimble. And if you start by worrying about how to protect the institution in the midst of this process, you're already in trouble. I did skip over one point earlier. I've done this with large groups of leadership, what I call a makerspace, which is a kind of intensive. And we're going to use the language of makerspace for our presentation toward the end of the semester. So I'll explain that more. But when I've done it, one of the hardest things I've found that's difficult is disembedding thought when people gather, and particularly when they gather at the invitation of any kind of an institution. It's hard to get them to stop thinking about the institution, particularly, I mean, just name the context, because they've been invited. Can you say board of trustees, right? Somebody's paid your money, you've all got there. And so automatically the first thing you want to do is go, how do we make this college work? I'm not just saying this for Melody's sake, but that no wonder then the institutional questions start to come up. So I'm not saying that's wrong, but all of a sudden if it's going, so what difference is this making in the lives of students in this community, those two constituencies? Now you're starting to say, how have we listened to those experiences, those hopes and expectations, those concerns and challenges in light of where they are? And empathy, and this is where empathy really kind of begins as a kind of core relationship. Now, if you heard their humor, you can do all that empathizing and still build a prototype, and people go, nah, that's not what I wanted. So this has got to be a process that continues to work almost like a wheel or a spiral. But you start where people are and who they, what, in some ways, you start with the very love of God for people before you think about God's defending the organization that you're a part of. And that's a really foreground, background kind of shift in how design thinking works. Okay. I am curious. So here's my question. So how many of you did your dashboards on work, play, love, and health? How many? Okay. How many of you actually wrote out your life view and your work view? How many of you go, you know, those are interesting assignments. I'd like to get to that at some point down the road, right? Yeah, you have been habituated to graduate reading, right? From that standpoint. Do I really need to know this? Is this really going to be on the test? Can I just go ahead and say to you, if you decide to go the Odyssey route, those components will be expected. Same way your own Kaufman's little digital workbook, typing away, getting all that information down, work the steps. I mean, this is not a book. I mean, most of the time you can read the chapter probably in 10 to 15 minutes. And even I can do that with my lips moving. I can almost do it that fast. It's not about the mastery of the content. It's really, again, learning the skill set of design thinking. And in this class, you won't do that unless you're actually doing the exercises as well. Okay. And that's, again, no harm, no foul. It's just a way for you to think about what you need to do as you're going forward. So in a way, now the other rail has dropped and you now have two workbooks. You have the Kaufman workbook, digital, online, hyped up, souped up, all kinds of stuff. And then you got this very popular text with a lot of cartoonish kind of line drawings. And let me just say again, if you've got a Kindle version, it's very difficult. But if you have even a hardback or a softback and you don't want to mess up a good book, if you're one of those kind of people who really, I mean, you even use pencil when you write a note in the margin so you can erase it later kind of person, that's why those PDFs are available to you. So go find them on the Moodle site so that you can use those, and the instructions are there, and use Word docs to kind of make some of these exercises happen, okay? More importantly, the reason you need to do this in this class, these kinds of questions of assessing where you are in your life and kind of knowing what is important when it comes to your life view and your work view is in some ways you're coming to empathize with who you are and where you are right now. And so this is empathy. You just actually get to use your own life to kind of be honest with yourself and kind of tap into who you are and where you are at that point. So instead of going out and doing 15 market surveys, or instead of even going out and creating a ethnographic engagement of where people are, which would be more probably what design thinkers would think about, you just get to use your life and come to terms with where you are in life from that standpoint. It's important in the book, partially because I just want to get you unstuck, but just kind of name where you are. But it's also for you to attend to your life as the very source of the kind of resources that goes into this design thinking. Everybody with me? Okay. I think this is why they start where they do. So if you, this is some of what you read, you know, these were some of the faulty thinkings that they decided to take on very early in the book. Your degree determines your career. If you're successful, you'll be happy. It's too late. Were you surprised by those when you were reading them? No. Or these kind of questions, how do I find the job that I like or maybe even love? How do I build a career that will make me a good living? How do I balance my career, my family? How can I make a difference in the world? And then the last one, how can I be thin, sexy, and fabulously rich? To which they say, we can't help you answer all these questions except the last one. And if you can figure out the last one, I think I know what your venture is going to be. And I just want to be the first investor. So I'll just name that from that standpoint, okay? How does this fit in relationship to the church? I mean, what would this kind of, how would this kind of language fit within church thinking? Just thinking about this out loud, what comes to mind?
Personally, I think that like as a kid and as a teen, like we got hammered with this idea of calling all the time. Like, what's God calling you to? Is God calling you to ministry? So then you're like, oh, geez, what kind of ministry? I think I have a call. Should I be a senior pastor, a youth pastor, a missionary, a chaplain? And so then it's like you're trying to chase down this calling. And then you get there and you're like, I don't like this at all, you know? So I think, something like this would have been very useful for me when I was younger and trying to figure out what God wanted for my life.
Okay. Yeah, so it wasn't just direct application, sometimes how we create what I call a geographic call. So Rachel's on board tonight, and Paul and both of you guys have been involved in missions, and so is Morgan. So you kind of get this. So I used to get, we always had that very question would always come to me when I taught the undergrad, right? And God has called me to be a youth pastor. And basically then the student would study youth ministry, and I get a call 3 years after they graduate and going, I think I'm going to go into senior ministry. Have I betrayed my call? To which I would say to them, no, that's kind of like when people used to say, you know, God has called me to make a difference in China. And so God has called me to China. And then they meet with the mission board and they go, you know, we think we're going to send you to Romania. But wait, no, God's called me to China. No, God's called you to mission, but the board says this is where you need. And we sometimes think of the definitiveness of saying God only calls us to a certain kind of geography, rather than understanding that part of that, it becomes a mutual discernment over time as circumstances changed. And those of you who have missionary friends know the surprise at times what happens when they actually do relocate, and the struggle for that at times. And so one of the things is just beginning to understand that calling might be much broader, and it might actually be a journey and what that calling looks like, and not so rigid and focused from that. Any other examples of this that you think in church language?
I think traditions within the church setting, if there's a set way of doing things, the practicality, or that determines the future of the church. This is the way, like if you're getting a new church, you're the senior pastor, and there's a set way of doing things. So that will determine the future of the church. So there's other paths to that. That's where the innovation comes in. So, and that's always a big question for even new pastors coming into a church.
Yeah. If we get, and let's just name it for churches, and churches that go through transition, they go, if we just get this kind of pastor, then. So again, design thinking is trying to get people unstuck from predetermined vision, instead of saying, well, when the minister arrives, who knows what might happen, but we're going to trust where God's going to be in the midst of that. That's just a different way of thinking about how design thinking moves. That's one time where it moves communities, not just individuals, in the way in which we exercise that. It can release you. It doesn't mean that you don't have to work. Believe me, design thinking has rigor, but it can release you from all kinds of stuckness, for lack of a better way of saying it, when you begin to realize what design thinking is trying to free you from, so that you can build you, as they say, build your way, trusting God, much like God leading Moses and the weird people of Israel through the desert, trusting God in the process instead of trying to predict exactly what the map looks like as a part of that journey. I actually think this is some of the times in the narrative when we get trying to match what you guys have probably had those books trying to match exactly where the Israelites went in the Sinai desert, right? And trying to prove exactly where, and some of you know, it never quite lines up that way in the narrative itself. I mean, we can't get those neat correspondences. I think there's a reason for that. I mean, in some ways, you don't need Google Maps to follow God, but there is embedded within this what the journey and the process of the journey is about that I think can be really helpful. And you're going to hear the language starting next week of pathfinding or wayfinding as a way going forward. 8:20. I think starting next week, I think it'll be next week. I'll probably have you guys meet twice. One to kind of talk again about Kaufman, but also since this is the first week of Design Your Life, I think since many of you might really, and I didn't expect everybody to do a lot of these exercises this week. So I wanted you to have a kind of reserve of reflection to talk to each other about where you are in your journey. So let me talk about one other big idea tonight, and we'll call it an evening. And that really is, this is a major principle inside design thinking that they sneak into the conversation at various points. As a matter of fact, we've already heard it tonight, but they'll talk more about it later. So let me just talk about the brief. Design thinkers start, while you might, in light of what I've described, you might think design thinkers don't do a lot of advanced planning. Yeah, they do. They do, in this process of empathizing, they do certain versions of market research or ethnographic research. They really do want to know more about where people are. They actually set that up early. And they began to use that to develop what they call a brief that then really sort of guides the design thinking process. And the brief is about two things. One is sort of setting up the need, at least initial need. And the other thing is to really help name the constraints so you can get at the problem in a correct way to try to solve it. So as much as it is about, remember those three sort of spheres, as much as it is the brief about user needs, it's also about the constraints. And a good brief really helps designers know how to move forward. And the biggest issue is probably gravity problems. So you've already read this. I'm going to play one more video set. Let's see, how long is it? Yeah, it's not as long. So let me play this, and then we'll move forward from that standpoint.
We're going to talk about gravity and gravity problems, because one of the things we notice is that a lot of people, and you guys are so far super smart folks, you're really good at solving problems. But you got to find good problems if you want to work on the things that we're talking about, how to have a more meaningful and more fulfilling life. So this idea of problem finding comes up again and again in design thinking. Are we working on the right problems? And there is a particular class of problem we're going to work on defining and reframing. There's a particular class of problems we call gravity problems. And we call them this because they are the kind of problem that you can't do anything about. Geez, Dave, I know you're a bicyclist, right?
am,
And
I'm a
I've noticed,
cyclist.
I noticed that as you're biking, as you get, I don't know, maybe it's older or something, but it seems like you're going slower and
I am
slower.
going slower. I notice I'm going up a hill slower than I'm used to. I look down, I'm actually in even a lower gear than I used to be. It's very disappointing. I figured out what's going on. It's this gravity stuff.
Yeah, it's holding.
So gravity is not working for me at all. And I really have a problem with gravity. Can you help me?
My answer is no. I can't help you. Gravity is not something that is actionable. Dave could get a lighter bike. He could get more gears. He could, he could work.
I do have this problem.
That's right, yeah. But he cannot change the fundamental fact that gravity exists. And there's a lot of gravity in problems in our lives. They sort of show up like this and they sound like this. Gee, when I started out, this was a little startup, but now the company's getting so big and it's really hard to get to the top anymore because it's so crowded. Can you help me fix that? Oh, is that fixable? Hey, I'm really through. This is that dysfunctional. I'm 3 years behind where I should be. I should be ahead of where I am right now. How do I catch up? Or, I've just got this amazing overseas assignment, but I got to be near mom. Dad just passed and mom needs support, but I want to go to take the Hong Kong deal. What do I do? Right? So these look like real problems, but they're actually not solvable. There's nothing you can do to solve them. And so what we say with gravity is we need a reframe. We need to take the problem and just accept that this is the kind of problem that cannot be solved. You cannot simultaneously be in Hong Kong and in Palo Alto at the same time. We know of no way to do that.
The problem isn't coming up with a better idea to change gravity. There is no idea. There's only acceptance.
Now, once you've accepted, you have the opportunity to completely reframe what the problem is. Let me show you how that kind of works. So on hey, the company's too big and it's hard to get to the top. What do I do? Well, there's nothing you can do. It's not a startup anymore. So just accept that fact. And now there's lots of people in line ahead of you for that vice president's promotion. So you're not going to get it. You're certainly not going to get it on the timetable that you thought. We were working with a very big company on the Valley. You use their thing all the time. Can't tell you who they are. And that's a problem. It used to be, hey, when I first got here, I was getting promoted every 6 months. And now we're a giant company and we're not getting promoted anymore. I don't like that. Well, the reframe on that, first of all, you accept it's not a startup. There's only two things you can accept it and then decide to work with it. So look, now that the company's so big, there's so many new opportunities for me to have roles where I could learn something. I wonder what interesting projects I could transfer to, and it'd be a lateral move instead of a vertical move. That's a perfectly valid reframe once I accept I'm not in a startup anymore. The other reframe would be, okay, the company's too big. I'm going to move to a startup because I love that energy of constant motion. But if you stick with the problem of, but here I am now at Facebook, Google, whatever, and it's too big and I don't like it being this big, can you please fix it? We're design guys, we can't fix that problem. It's not actionable. It's just a circumstance. Hey, I'm really 3 years behind. How do I catch up? This one's my favorite. This is that dysfunctional belief. There is no reframe. You're not behind. What are you behind? Behind what? Behind some expectation you had of yourself, but that was based on a plan, and reality got in the middle of that plan and it didn't work that way. And I'll bet you spent some time of that 3 years doing something that was incredibly valuable. So you're not behind. You're not behind your timetable. You're not behind anyone else. You're right here, right now. And this is the place that you can move from. Once you accept that this is the place you can move from, and what's available from here going forward, gravity just disappears. Love to take that overseas assignment, but I got to be near mom. Hong Kong, I got to solve the mom problem. What do I do with mom? Well, I either defer this and decide that right now for the next year or two, I need to be with mom. Because she's by herself for the first time in 40, 50 years. So that's my choice. I don't get to do both things. Or, hey mom, I'm for an adventure. Want to come to Hong Kong with me? We'll see how that goes. One way or the other, I'm not dumping mom, okay? So it's either we're doing mom here, we're doing mom there, make a real choice. But I'm not solving mom. It's truly a radical acceptance, right? That the situation I'm in right now is the only situation available to me. There's nothing I can do about it. I can't change the situation. It's not a problem to be solved. It's just the way things are. Once I sort of accept the things you cannot change philosophy, once I'm there, then I'm free to reframe the problem and create some new space for me. Maybe mom comes with me. Maybe I just don't take the promotion. What's the big deal? Maybe I just decide I'm not behind. I am exactly where I should be right now. And by changing the way I framed this problem, it moves out of gravity into acceptance, and from acceptance to something I can do something about. So obviously, we would like you to try this. We all have a little gravity worksheet. It's a reframing.
I'll stop there. Comments? Just things that you heard? Questions?
From gravity to acceptance to doing something about it. That's the way to reframe it. That really resonated.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Anyone else? Of course, you've never probably, I know their illustrations probably doesn't match quite yours unless you have been part of a startup and it's now a Fortune 500 company. But can you think of gravity problems in congregational settings?
I think all the time. There's so many people finding themselves, or I see this a lot with single moms, or just younger women who have been going through their career and now they are home with their babies and they wish they could be out in the work field. It's exactly what he said, gravity problems. It's not a problem. First of all, it's a circumstance that happened and you took responsibility to do this. So by accepting it, it would actually be a way to move forward in the fact that it's a joy to be a mom. And I'm not going to be, I'm going to miss these years if I go to work. So it's kind of a blessing. So I've seen that happen specifically with that group of people.
Others, anything?
I've seen it a lot with people, like mostly like women that I'm talking to in their mid-20s that have done a lot of ministry in their beginning 20s, like right after college. And they're like, I wasted these years. Like, this is nothing on a resume, because they're like going into the business world and they're like, I was overseas most of my 20s. How do I promote that to a hospital? And so I think, yeah, reframing that. And I mean, this is like part of what I want to do, but like reframing your experience in your job, like you can pitch something however you want it to sound. I mean, as long as you stay honest, right? So don't lie to people on your resume, but like you can rephrase things. Like I was a social justice coordinator when I was in India. That actually was my title, but that's not all I was doing. But that's what's on my resume. Because that sounds a lot more hireable than I was a missionary in India for 3 years in my mid-20s.
Well, and again here, and so you were. So how do you use that? I mean, quite literally is what you've decided to do, as opposed to saying, "Can I get those 3 years back?" No, you can't. Or 5 years back. And I do think one thing is it solves a lot of what I call regretting when this is done well from that standpoint. Deanna, I see a hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I guess sort of in line with like what I want to do too. A lot of times pastors will be like, well, my leadership won't let me make those changes. or my context or my style or my people. There's always a reason. I can't force change on them. But instead learning to like work within those parameters and bring people along with you instead of seeing them as kind of like in the way. Like they're not in the way. They just need vision and purpose and all of that.
And gravity problem would say, you're right, you can't force change. So how might we instead work on this? Becomes I hope you hear it begins to name the constraints that you can't fix. So you can begin to find the ways in which you can reframe the problem so you can move forward. Kind of a rule of thumb, by the way, is inside design thinking is instead of talking about we should or we must, you ask the question, how might we? And that's just a simple way of shifting to more of a design thinking mindset. Maybe we should do this, but the church can't. Okay, it can't. Maybe we must do this or the church survive, but we can't because we can't just automatically make that happen. But how might we, in the midst of the context we find ourselves, move forward? And it's a really different way of kind of understanding what's going on. So for you, one of the things I think they're trying to get, and when you start doing the health, work, play, love, and assessment, and normally you don't have to share that, by the way, right away in here, but it's really saying, even as you think about your own life balance, and so maybe it is out of balance. You're in grad school, give me a break. So how are you going to try to survive in the midst of the busyness of where you are and the things you want to do, and still get a graduate education as a part of it? That's the kind of thing that they're trying to get at, even as you think about your own life. Melly?
So I was just thinking that I kind of have a better ability to see other people's gravity problems than my own because it's not just a problem. It's like an emotional issue. It's something that you feel, you feel stuck, and it doesn't matter that, you can't do anything about it. It's hard to accept and so I find that actually what's most helpful for me is to have people of wisdom and who know me well to point out those things that I'm perseverating on that I really can't do anything about. So I should just stop. Because sometimes I can't do it myself.
Right. And that's why this is such important. It is important to do this, even though this book seems very individualistic, but to do this in community, which is what we'll start picking up on next week, is really important, because it's not quite that we have a blind spot. It's just that the depth of that gravity is so deep, sometimes it's hard to let that go from that standpoint. That just becomes part of our own personal journey of what's happening here. Paula?
I was just gonna say, add to that I think we're fooling ourselves saying that we don't see it. We do see it. We're just being stubborn, and we don't want to change. We don't want to accept the gravity problems in our own life. But when we do accept it, and I can speak for my own life, after realizing that I need to accept it, this gravity problem, I was able to move forward. But until then, I was stuck. So I was stubborn and too proud to recognize, I am stuck and I need to, this is the world, this is what happens. So I just have to find another way to get out of here. So stubbornness is a part of it, right?
It is. And the reason I have this line down at the bottom, do you believe in the doctrine of election? No, I'm not talking about whether you're eternally secure or not. So let's put that one aside. But it's really interesting to me that people sometimes would almost talk about their circumstance as if it can't change. It's almost God has elected them to this particular spot in life, right? So they may not think about election in light of soteriology. They may be firmly convinced Wesleyans at that point. But then when they think about their life circumstance, they start to sound like hard-shelled Calvinists in the way in which they think their lives are stuck in a particular way. Does that make sense? And I have to say, I would love for them to actually just become Wesleyans in the midst of that. So how might we move forward? And I hope you hear that language in design thinking is a release. it isn't because you have failed, it's circumstance a lot of times. The really sorting out the problems you can solve, naming constraints you can't fix, you just deal with them and move forward or either around them, really becomes one of the most important gifts inside design thinking. And I'll probably spend more time about this a little bit later as well, but it really is crucial. There's a quote, and I really, I'll only pick up at the bottom of it. It's on page 13 and 14. I don't need to read it to you at this point, but it just says, and this is where all good designers begin. This is the you are here and accept phase of design thinking. Acceptance. That's why you start where you are, not where you wish you were, not where you hope you are, not where you think you should be, but right where you are. And frankly, if those of you who've been in churches who've lamented, this is the Back to Egypt committee shows up and all the things they wish that the church should and ought to be, to kind of go, but folks, this is where we are. So how might we move forward? How do we get past? I mean, and I hope you hear there is a pastoral side to lamentation. I get that. But about the fifth meeting, church board meeting with the same laments, you finally have to get to the point and say, but this is where we are. So how's the Spirit going to move us from where we are, not from where we were or where we think we ought to be, but where we are. And design thinking is just honest about that. And what are the constraints? What are the things that we can't change? You know, if we're a congregation, classic one is we're a congregation where the youngest person in the congregation tends to look like me. You know, I don't think coming and saying, how do we reach young families? Or we ought to be reaching young families. And it's one thing to say, yes, we ought to, and then just wrestle with that, as opposed to saying, well, take a look at the room. This is where we are right now. So recognizing that, the youngest person in the room's probably got grandkids instead of kids. How might we think about what that looks like? It's merely that kind of invitation to get past the shoulds and oughts that you can't fix to the possibilities of how you might change things. And this is, if anything, this is one of the kind of gifts inside design thinking that is not just a fatalistic pragmatism. It really is a kind of sense of just acknowledging something that many times in scripture, God has to intervene in the midst of even prophets. I mean, I'm mindful of the story of Elijah, and he's lamenting about how bad, and a guy comes in a small voice, says, have you really taken stock of what's going on out there and what's happening where you are? That's a different way of thinking about how we're engaged from that standpoint. Okay, 8:40. Let me stay on. So let me just kind of name kind of where we are, and I really want to stress this. If you haven't been working on it, and I get that, I mean, I hope you hear there's no harm, no foul. But if you want to learn design thinking, doing the exercises in the book are exercises of design, though they're done with your own life in mind. So the first part of the book is basically saying, where are you? And where is your life when it comes to work, play, health, and love? I mean, you're here now. And so what does that look like? And taking just honest stock from that standpoint. And then begin thinking about what the future might look like becomes what design thinking is all about. Does that make sense to everybody? I don't think there's much more to say other than let me just encourage you kind of understanding where you are in the process of the class. At this point, you have sort of two options in front of you, two models of literally thinking that can actually resource this broader vision of transformational leadership. One is the entrepreneurship model, which is really about creating and being innovative around a project, if you will, sort of external to you, but something that could be passionate that you find yourself connected to. And how do you think, and I'll use this language, in a way that you begin to mitigate, I mean, not mitigate, manage, not mitigate the risk, but manage the risk as you seek to see your life unfold in and through this project. And you lead not knowing whether the project's going to be successful or not. Some of you probably after this week wonder if it could ever be successful, but we don't know that yet. I mean, this is part of how you work the steps to kind of at least assure that at least by the time you invite people to buy into the venture, the vision of this, you've tried to answer some really crucial steps and questions through a process of advanced discernment. Does that make sense? And for most of us, I think that's fun. For Brandon, bad news, you launch next week. And there may be a moment you're going, did we ask these questions as we were putting this thing together? So you're a little bit different in the journey. But for most of us, this is still an intellectual exercise. I have not asked for you to set up a GoFundMe page at this point, much less set aside your 501c3 savings, which for people like Morgan who are on the mission field, you're still wondering what that term means, right? Savings. But I'm not asking you to invest except in the energy that you would put in to try to think how you bring a venture fully to life. The other option is this, and more interesting is, how do you envision maybe your own life and what it might look like if you start now where you are and start employing design principles, not for an organization, but just in your own life and what that might look like. And both of these kinds of models will be kind of bouncing back and forth in sort of how we begin to develop skill sets in light of the reading that we're doing. Does that make sense? The bigger underneathness of it is not necessarily the success of the venture, nor is it that you actually reinvent your life by the end of this class. I mean, I'm thinking of some of you going to your spouses saying, I get to reinvent my entire life. To which your spouse says, can I have a conversation with you in the middle of this process that you're planning, right? But it is learning these kind of, really kind of getting into the granular of how these thinking process work and kind of learning the language, the grammar that goes along within it, okay? Any concerns? All right. Well, I'm going to let you go 15 minutes early. For some of you, that just means you're going right to sleep. I get that. So, Rachel, for all those times I've held you over to like 9:01 or 9:02, I'm giving 15 minutes back this evening. If you have not done the exercise in the book, this might be something you could do. Probably several of them in 15 minutes. So you actually could get, quote, caught up and you don't lose all that time somewhere down the road. But I'll leave that up to you. And we'll pick up next week and we'll spend time, probably a little bit less on lecture like I did this week, a little bit more unpacking both the resources and then spending time in group together, trying to unpack what these look like with friends that you've already been in conversation with. Okay. All right. Blessings, everybody. Have a good evening. I'll hang until everybody leaves in case there's a last minute question.
I guess I'm one of the last minute questions here. Oh, I'm the last minute question. Okay. So the second option, understanding that we're still going through the Kaufman curriculum.
Right.
Just knowing that we're not going to have an end project in there or a business come out of it, right?
Right.
So the second option, what you called the Odyssey, I'm guessing that's like personal odyssey from the way it's sounding.
Yes.
Is that where we go and we print out the PDFs that you have there and go through all of those, like the steps in the book, or
Yes.
is that basically what it consists of?
Hang on a second. I'm going to let this run just for a second, just
Sure.
in case. But yes, as a matter of fact, the book will take you through to the back end of the Odyssey plan. So
Okay.
in a way, the book is designed to take you exactly to that point.
Okay,
And
perfectly. Perfectly explained. So then, so basically we're doing all of the steps in the book. just like we would do all the steps on, and we will do all of the steps on Kaufman as well. So, and then are we just turning in all of that work?
As a
At the
uniform,
end,
as a uniform narrative. So it becomes, instead of a set of discrete, the same way you would complete the Kaufman curriculum to have a uniform business plan that is highly formatted, if you go and look at it.
Okay,
By the time you're finished with this book, it doesn't have as neat a formula, but
okay,
you will have an ability way of narrating the Odyssey plans and to name them and explain them from that standpoint. So in a
Okay.
way, the same way you are typing into the workbook, information is being stored on that workspace that eventually you can sculpt.
Mhm.
Simple exercises you're doing inside this book, and taking the time, as they said, 250 words for a life view, 250 words for a work view.
Yeah,
You're building all these resources that will culminate into a narrative on the back end.
okay, all right. Yeah, I hadn't looked ahead in the book.
Okay.
Sometimes that's a little discouraging if you like look at how many pages are in the book. So any of our reading I do, I don't go to the end and look at how many pages. If you have it listed in the syllabus, I don't read it because I don't want to know, because then I just look at my page number and think, oh, I've got this many pages to go. So I haven't explored the back of the book, so I was not aware that it would like took you through that journey, but I'm actually looking forward to doing it. So that's cool.
Okay.
All right.
For some students, it becomes, it really does become liberating.
Mhm.
I have had students suddenly decide to do some pretty amazing things that had nothing to do with building a venture, but had everything to do with their lives out of that.
Yeah.
So it's just giving people option A or option B in the class.
Yeah, well, I like this idea. I feel like this is something that I maybe, the whole design thinking thing is something I maybe should have been doing all along. I think one of the other students also said that. But also I like the idea because I kind of feel like in my life right now that I'm starting over. So it's kind of cool to be like, okay, so I'm starting right here. This is what we've got. Let's go,
And
I like
Holly,
it.
yeah, and you really literally you go, I'm here now, and
Yeah.
can't unring bells of the past, can't
Mhm.
design a certain particular. I can't relive certain visions, but this is where I am. So what am I going to do? And literally 3 to 5 years from now, and how do I get there? Becomes part of what
Yeah.
the design thinking is designed should do for this class. You can use those principles with a congregation or other people in mind. It's just the very stuff of your own life becomes the fabric for which to do that. And I'm not assigning you to go find a church to actually take the church through this process. I'm just saying,
Right.
go in life and figure out how this would work from that standpoint.
Yeah, and something that can continue to use in the future then.
Very much
So,
so. Okay.
yeah, okay. Thank you, sir. Have a good
Well,
night.
blessings to you. Have a good evening.
Thanks.